Today I'm going to show you guys my updated recipe on dumplings. This is the recipe I use when I'm making chicken and dumpling, and it is a crowd favorite. I can guarantee you if you use this recipe, everyone in your family is going to love it. So first, I just start with 2 cups of flour, then add in a bit of baking powder. The baking powder is going to make your dumplings light and airy. I never measure, I just sprinkle a little bit. If I had to guesstimate though, it looks like I poured about 1 to 2 teaspoons. I then add a bit of Celtic salt. Now remember, if you're putting these dumplings into a soup that has been salted, you don't want to oversalt them because the salt from the soup will leach into the dumplings. This also goes for the butter. If you're using salted butter, you don't want to get too salt happy. Now, as you can see, I'm using butter from a tub. We have actually been using raw butter from our local farmer, which me and my husband are both loving. So when you add in the butter, you just want to put a few dollops and gently press the butter into the flour mixture and just keep pressing it until it turns into a sand-like texture. I had some extra bacon grease on the counter, so I added a tiny little bit for flavor, but this step is totally unnecessary. So just keep pressing until it's nice and sandy. Now, this is something that I wrote about in the blog post that has really upped my dumpling game. One time, I did not have any chicken eggs on hand, so I decided to use duck eggs. And I gotta tell you guys, this has been a game changer for me with the dumplings. So here I'm using 2 duck eggs. I don't know what it is about them, but they tend to give the baked goods and the dumplings a more chewy texture. So for dumplings, if I'm able, I will always use duck eggs. If you guys haven't ever tried them, I highly suggest it. You can go to your local farmer and see if they have some organic pasture-raised duck eggs. These will literally change your cooking game when you're doing baked goods. Now, make sure to only use the yolks. And of course, don't throw out the egg whites. You can find something else to cook them with. I continue to press and keep that sandy texture. And here I am using raw milk for the dumplings. Not that it matters that it's raw because we are going to cook the dumplings. I started using milk because it has a nice creamier flavor. But if you don't want to use milk, you can totally substitute it with ice cold water. If you've seen my other video on dumplings, you will see that I always used cold water before. But now, like I said, I do like to use milk because it just makes the dumplings a little bit more creamy. When you pour it, don't pour too much. Just gently pour it until it starts to turn doughy. And don't worry if you pour too much, you can just add a little bit more flour. As you can see, I am pressing the dough and making sure it isn't too wet. And you want to make sure your dumplings aren't too wet because the texture will be all wrong when you cook them. Now that I'm done working the dough, I just like to let it rest for about an hour. So I had this delicious chicken soup in the freezer that I had made about 2 months ago. And I also had some bone broth cubes made with bones and a little bit of oxtail juice that I froze. So I added those cubes in for a little bit more flavor. And oh my goodness, the flavor was just absolutely incredible. So while the dough is resting, I'm heating up the soup to get all that ice nice and melted. The dough should rest for about an hour. And here, after mine had rested, I noticed that it was still a little too wet. So I just grabbed some flour and started to gently press that flour in so that the dough would have a nice Play-Doh texture to it. You want to be able to pull the dumplings off into pieces, and the dough should not be sticky at all. And you can flatten them, but you don't have to. I flatten mine just a bit because they do poof back up. Before you start putting your dumplings into the soup, it's important that the soup is boiling hot. So you just want to grab the dumplings, gently pull them off, and then just put them into the soup. And because you want the dumplings to cook evenly, it's important to get them in as quickly as possible. And if you're struggling to get them in all at the same time, just turn the fire off. It's fine because your soup will be hot, and then turn the fire back on once you've gotten ahead and you can get all those dumplings in there. I'd say to cook them for about 2 to 3 minutes and then turn the fire off. They're all going to float to the top, but once the fire is off and you cover it with the lid, they're going to sink to the bottom, and they're going to continue cooking if any of them are even still raw because that soup is going to be nice and hot. I usually just let mine sit in the crock for about an hour before we eat them. And please remember, you don't want to overcook the dumplings because they will turn mushy. Remember, the soup is already boiling hot, so they will continue to cook once the fire is off. So a good 2 minutes or so should be good enough. This is the soup after sitting for about an hour. It's absolutely perfect and so full of flavor. If you have some oxtail broth or bone broth from other meats, you should add it into your chicken soup because the flavor is going to literally knock your socks off. And of course, it's also going to be very nutrient dense for you and your family. I have had people ask me if they can freeze the dumplings. I don't personally suggest this. They do accumulate ice and become very mushy. However, you can store them in the fridge for 3 to 5 days, and every time you heat them up, they're going to maintain their perfect texture. I hope you guys enjoy and let me know what you think.